All right, good afternoon. Want to welcome everybody to joining our first Inclusion Belonging education series on having productive conversations about race and ethnicity. Um, we'll give a couple people a couple more minutes, but while you do that, feel free to jump in the chat box and put how you're feeling today, or is there something that you want to take away from the topic in the conversation? And we'll wait a couple minutes to get more people in, and then we'll get started. Give it about another minute or so, and then we'll jump in. All right, so we'll go ahead and jump in and get started. Once again, thank you guys for joining us. I'll do a brief intro of myself, Steve Bailey, Director of Events for Junior Volleyball Association. And then I get to co-lead our task force with Lauren Ray, and obviously kind of helping bridge this gap and talking about inclusion, belonging topic that it's fun for us to begin having. So a couple housekeeping things. We just ask that you keep yourself muted as we go through the discussion. And through the next hour or so. But then please feel free to throw some questions, ideas, thoughts, anything you might have in the chat box. We'll love any engagement that we can get. But know that we do have a jam-packed agenda, so we will do our best to get through questions at the end. So if you can put that in the chat box, that's great, and we can help facilitate that as well. But no, we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end. So just kind of a disclaimer with this, we are not claiming to be the world's greatest, best experts. But as we've seen over the last 8 months or so, our world for everybody has changed, and so this is our way as a group collectively to give back to the sport, to kind of make the sport overall, especially in the junior space, more inclusive and inviting for everybody. So this is the way that we felt is necessary, or is the best avenue to do that. And so we welcome that everyone is at least willing to be a part of this and work through this with us. So I'll share a quick story for me, why it's important. I've been fortunate throughout my time of, over 20 years of being in the sport. Most people don't realize, but I grew up on the south side of Chicago inner city. And thank my mom all the time. When I was in sixth grade, she decided to move me out into the suburb area, which is what opened up a lot of doors for me. So without that move and change, I don't think I'm sitting in the spot that I'm sitting in today, talking to you, I'm doing what I'm doing. So that part for me is important. But during that time and throughout those steps, there was a lot of different situations, scenarios, things that happened, that molded me into the person I am today. So in order for me to be here and help assist and give back, I feel this is my way of helping give back, to help spread my voice, to help maybe somebody who does not know how to, or is looking for a way to talk, or looking for a way to better themselves. That's what we're here for. So this is why this topic is important to me, and will help any way I can, and kind of foster conversations, ideas, thoughts, with anybody to help make the sport a better place. So that's my little 2-minute spiel. Michelle, I'm gonna toss it to you and let's see what you got.
All right. Okay. So I'm Michelle Ahrens. I coach at Atlanta Elite, and I've been coaching there for, I don't want to say how many years, 16 years, 17 years. That makes me sound old. But I also work for State Farm Insurance Company, where I am in charge of recruiting and hiring for actuarial and modeling areas. And so this topic for me hits on a lot of different lenses, because not only is this something that I'm trying to learn and grow at as a coach, it's also a really important part of my job as a hiring leader to make sure that I'm really thinking about how we bring in and appreciate diverse perspectives in our workforce. So that's a little bit about me. In terms of why this topic matters to me as a coach, it actually just makes me want to talk about the two girls that we'll be hearing from a lot today. So the two players that we have with us. to work through this dialogue session are Riley Hinton and Savannah Matthews. They'll be introducing themselves here in a minute. But they are two players that are near and dear to my heart that played for me a few years back. And they're two of the key players that really opened my eyes to how diversity and inclusion is something that I, as a coach, need to bring more intent to and think differently about how we have open dialogue on this topic. And so I can kind of share a personal story. So every year we go to what we call OWLS, which is where we go to this outdoor leadership camp, and we are out in the cold, climbing obstacles and learning about ourselves and about each other along the way. And one of the activities that we do at night is really just sit down and try to really deeply get to know each other. And that's where I start to begin to set expectations of my ground rules for the girls as a member of our team. And every year, one of the things I walk through is certain words that we are not allowed to use. So I have 2 words that as a team we're not allowed to use, are the same 2 words that I've had pretty much my whole coaching career. I keep the list short. It's nothing cheesy like I can't. And for those of you that know me, you obviously know it's not swear words either. So, but as I was going through this conversation, it was Riley that really challenged me and said, Michelle, tell me why the N word isn't on that list. And it was one of those earth-shattering moments in your coaching career where at first I was probably a little defensive. And I think I said back something along the lines of, well, my goal is to just clarify words that are commonly used that I don't want used on our team. And Riley was basically like, well, it is commonly used. I hear it every day. And again, it was one of those moments where my jaw just dropped. It was a new lens that I had not thought of. And it was this moment where I realized that my experience in our community is very different than Riley and Savannah's experience in our community. And so since then, I've continued to learn in this space. A year later, I was having dinner with Riley and she was helping me work through how I talk about race with my children. And then over the last couple of months, it's been so amazing watching these 2 girls advocate in a lot of different ways. They've been at marches, they've been on the news, and it's just been such a cool journey to watch them advocate for themselves and to advocate for all of the other athletes that they represent. And so in terms of why this matters to me, it matters for a lot of reasons, but it matters to me most because the players that I love are impacted by this topic. And I want to make sure I do everything I can to advocate for them. So with that, I'll turn it over to Riley and Savannah so they can introduce themselves. And maybe Riley, I'll turn it to you first.
Hi, I'm Riley Hinton. I am a member of the Illinois volleyball team now, but like Michelle said, I did play for her a couple years ago. And I guess one of the first times that I really experienced racism, I'll just kind of piggyback off of Michelle's story, was when I was playing at Illini Elite, but it was actually the year before I was on Michelle's team. And I had a teammate who just continuously used the N-word, like in common sentences. She used it to address me, and I told her time and time after again that it made me very uncomfortable. Please stop doing it. And she just blatantly just disregarded me, said that she wasn't going to stop. And I mean, that was really hard for me. It was the first time anything like that had happened to me. And I mean, we were all like 15, 16 years old, so nobody really knew what to do, how to handle it. So, I mean, it felt super lonely. I didn't feel comfortable enough with my coach at the time to talk about it. And Illini Elite and volleyball in general is just really my safe space. So to have something like that come into that world was really eye-opening and made me think like, wow, this happens literally everywhere. And like, this is a topic that should be talked about everywhere. So then kind of like what Michelle said, I was on her team the next year, and that's when we started addressing it. And so that's kind of also like my why, like why I think it's important to talk about it everywhere, because it really does happen everywhere. Sav?
Yeah, so I am on the Kent State volleyball team. I was also on Michelle's team and on Riley's team the year before with the same girl. So my why is also similar to that. But other than that, I grew up in a very conservative, small, like predominantly white town. I think maybe there were like 5 or 6 kids in my class at the time that were of color. And so my whole life I had heard like racial slurs, or, it really would be anything from like making fun of my hair to racial slurs. So it wasn't anything new to me when I had that teammate say things like that. But I guess my why would be, for looking at like a coach's perspective, you have so many young, impressionable minds, and that just kind of goes to show that you can make an impact on them. So whatever they're hearing at home, like racism, you aren't born that way, it's taught that way. So you can really make a difference on how you are speaking to your kids, like, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both for sharing those personal stories. I know that that is not easy to talk about. So we're just so grateful that you're here today to share some of your experiences so that more coaches can see firsthand the impact this can have on athletes when we're not being intentional about how we have these conversations. So thank you guys so much. All right, so now is basically what I would call likely the boring part of the webinar. So from here, I'm going to start really kind of covering the meat of the content that we want to get through today. And I'm going to try to be intentional to pause for space along the way so that people can chime in. We want to make sure we're still hearing from Riley and Savannah and how they feel about what we're talking about. But really, we're just going to kind of try to quickly dive through the key learnings we want to make sure we take away from today. And then we'll get back to some more dialogue. So I'm going to cover 3 key things. First, why I think coaches need to be talking about this. Second, basic logistics of some things to think about before you begin. And third, some more detailed thoughts on how, as coaches, we can create an environment for open dialogue as well as conducting sessions that elicit effective conversation. Those are the 3 things we're going to work through. So first of all, just to quickly hit on why I think this is important for us to do as coaches, because I do think that that is a big thing that we have to call it get over the hump on is maybe an overstatement, but to encourage ourselves and others to really truly believe that this is our role, I think is challenging. I think a lot of us prefer to just coach volleyball, right? So that's why I really want to start with this point. But the role of a good coach obviously is far more than just organizing practices and trying to win games. If volleyball is the only thing our players learn from us, it's very likely that we've missed an opportunity to really impact their lives in a deeper way. And so, and keep in mind, for a lot of us, realistically, in a given week, we might spend more time with our athletes than they spend with their own parents. And so it's a responsibility that we shouldn't take lightly. And it's something that we need to make sure we bring intent to, and to make sure that we are being intentional about how we plan for the life lessons we want them to carry with them outside of the gym. And although as coaches, all of us will have different lessons we want our athletes to learn, we all still have a common starting point that we need to begin at. And the first step to helping our athletes be comfortable enough to embrace the life lessons we're trying to teach them is that we have to show them early that we care about them as individuals. So it's our job as coaches to show them every single day that we care about so much more than volleyball. And that in and of itself takes intent and planning as a coach. And so to pivot more directly into why we're here today and why we think it's important to talk about this topic, as coaches, we have to acknowledge and honor the different backgrounds and perspectives that each of our athletes brings into the gym. And by honoring those perspectives, we show our players that we see them for who they are. We show our players that we value them, and we show them that we want them to be respected and included as part of our team. So that, for me, is why this is part of our role as coaches. To get more into the tactical content, I wanted to start with maybe just kind of 4 logistical tips to think about before you begin having dialogue on this topic. And what I'm going to do to just kind of help follow along is I'm going to put in the chat window, that might not look very good, but I'm going to try to put in the chat window the 4 key things that I'll be talking through. Sorry, that doesn't look wonderful, but it might still help follow along. So the first logistical tip before we begin is that especially when working with young athletes, we have to be sensitive to their age and sensitive to what their parents want them having dialogue on as an athlete in your program. And so it's likely important to make sure that you have some level of consent from the players and the parents before you begin talking about some of these sensitive topics. I think as a coach, I also really like to encourage my kids to talk about what they're learning at home. We want the parents to be comfortable with what they're learning from you. And part of that is the athlete being able to share openly with their parents some of what they're learning. So I think consent is one of the first things to think about before you begin. The next thing to think about before you begin is context. Reflect on where you and where your team are coming from. Think about the makeup of your team. Think about the different aspects that they bring between race, sexual orientation, economic background, and think about how the topics that you want to discuss may impact them differently at an individual level. And also maybe give some intent to, are there certain players on your team that you'd like to talk with first individually before you begin these discussions as a team? You want to make sure that, especially when you have players that are in an underrepresented group, that they're comfortable with your planned approach and that they understand you want to be their ally, but that they know that you don't expect them to be the educator in this case. We don't want to put too much burden on our athletes just because they're in the underrepresented group, that they have to be the one leading the dialogue. So having some of that conversation with them before you begin can often be really helpful to get you off on the right foot. The next thing is thinking about your why. So I think it's important as you begin having conversations on inclusion and diversity that we take time to explain to our team before we begin why this is important to them as a team and why it's important to you as a coach. Just a couple of key message points there to help bring that home. Inclusion matters because our athletes can do nothing other than bringing their whole selves to practice every day. And when our players don't feel psychologically safe and supported, it's hard for them to bring their best self to practice every day. And so one of our roles as a coach is to make sure that we are setting the groundwork so that everybody feels like they can bring their best self to practice. And these discussions can help our athletes feel seen and heard and know and understand the important role they play on their teams. The last thing to think about before you begin topics or discussions on the topic of inclusion is thinking about trust. Having trust is really a precursor to being able to have conversations of this nature. And later next week, we'll be following up with a written piece that kind of hits on some of these topics that we're covering today. And in that written piece, there'll be some tips for developing trust early with your team. But as coaches, really a big part of our role is we have to put in the work early in team development to make sure that we're developing the trust that is needed to be able to have effective dialogue on this topic. And we have to do that work off the court and on the court to show your girls that you'll invest in them. And when you show them that you're willing to invest in them and that you trust them, they'll invest in you, they'll invest in each other, and it'll create the dynamic and the environment that we need to be able to have these important conversations. All right, so the next topic that will, and again, the last of the boring part here, and then we'll get back to dialogue, but the next thing we want to hit on is tips for actually having this dialogue in an effective way. And again, I'm going to try to paste into the chat window again. Hopefully it pastes better this time. We'll see. But here are basically the key points that I'll be working through so that you can kind of follow along with me as we go. And let me start by just saying, as we talk through how to have effective conversation on inclusion, like the list of tips of how to do this effectively could literally be 200 items long, right? We could be here all day thinking about how do we really do this well. But obviously we're trying to keep this to 10 minutes. And So this is just my, one coach's perception on things I've thought about as I begin, and things that I've thought have helped lead some better and more open discussions with my teams. But just know this is just a start. It's fairly high level, and there's so much in each of these elements that as a coach you could learn and dive into and explore. And so this is really just intended to be fairly high level to get you thinking about how can you prepare yourself to better lead this dialogue. But so on the topic of preparation, I think that the first key step here to leading effective dialogue on inclusion is that we as coaches have to prepare. If we, a lot of us have not been formally trained on how to lead dialogue sessions, and let alone lead dialogue sessions on sensitive topics, right? And so we have to do some homework here to really feel ready to create the environment we need and also lead the dialogue in an effective way. And for me personally, I think one of the most important things that we can do as individuals to ready ourselves for these conversations is to, in our personal lives, be intentional about how we spend time with people that are different from us. The more comfortable you are in your individual life, meeting people that are different from you, asking them questions, being curious, and learning from their perspective, the more comfortable you're going to be leading dialogue on those same topics with your team. And I already mentioned that we'll have some of our resources coming next week, but we'll definitely be giving you a lot of resources next week that can help you begin to broaden your knowledge on how to have effective conversations on this topic. So the second key thing to do as you think about leading effective dialogue here is to establish conversation ground rules. Again, some of these topics can be sensitive, they can be hard, and so it's important that before we begin, we really have clear expectations of what's inbounds and out of bounds for our athletes. As we step into these conversations, we have to insist on respect, and respect isn't just about manners, it's about our word choices, our tone, and the attitude that we bring when we listen and ask questions. The fastest way to diminish the value of any dialogue that we're having is to not convey our willingness to learn. And so we have to really set that expectation early, that inclusion and shared learning is our goal here, and doing that early as we begin these conversations. The third key thing to think about as we're having this dialogue is to make sure that our athletes know that this is a safe space where they can be brave. We have to admit that sharing perspectives like this can be a little bit uncomfortable, but we have to all agree to stretch the boundaries of our comfort and to create trusting spaces where a little bit of discomfort is okay, and that we all acknowledge and know that we're here together to challenge our boundaries so that we can learn and grow as a team, so that we can be better as we move forward. And I know as we were preparing for this conversation, Riley thought she might have some insights to share here on creating a brave space. So Riley, do you want to maybe share some of your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so I had a lot of conversations in these past couple months with my team. And basically something that I just really emphasized is being like comfortable with getting uncomfortable, and also just emphasizing to them that like this is a safe space. Like I'm here to have these uncomfortable conversations, and I always told them that I don't want them to be scared of saying the wrong thing, because this is a safe space and that's how we learn, by saying things that we think are wrong. And so I guess just like making sure they understand that it is going to be uncomfortable, but that's how we make progress, and to just know that they can trust me and I'm never going to attack them if they say something wrong, but we're all just doing this so we can all learn together.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Riley. Thanks for sharing that. So to keep working forward, one of the other key things that we need to do to have effective dialogue on inclusion is to make sure that we are being good listeners. And being a good listener isn't just about nodding our heads in silence, right? It's about being in tune with what's happening in our head to make sure that we are listening deeply to what people around us are sharing in terms of their experiences. And so as we think about listening, one of the most important things we can do as coaches is to set the expectation that these conversations around inclusion are a dialogue, not a debate. And so dialogue is intended to be an open-ended forum where we can express our experiences and our viewpoints. And each of our individual experiences are not up for debate. And so really setting that with our athletes as we begin those conversations is important. We have to come into these conversations with an intent of not just sharing our thoughts, but also coming with the goal of better understanding through listening another person's point of view. And it's really important that we embrace the power of humble listening by putting away our egos and doing our best to manage assumptions that we are bringing into the conversation as we reflect on other people's experiences. And so kind of leading right into the next point then, another important thing that we need to be doing here as athletes and coaches is really self-reflecting through this process. So as we're listening to others, we have to reflect on what's happening in our body in the moment and really making sure that we are managing our internal dialogue and assuming positive intent from everybody as they're sharing their experiences. Being intentional about how we put aside judgment and focus on what each person is trying to convey, even if their words are not perfect. I think, so moving into the next point, the next thing is that we all have to be willing to admit when we make mistakes. And I think also a part of that is being willing, though, to call out when you hear others make mistakes, right? So I'm even going to pivot back a little bit to Riley's story. You know, I think maybe the saddest part of the story for me as I hear Riley is, you know, Riley is experiencing this situation and speaking out for herself, but like, where were her advocates in that moment, right? How could we have better trained the team also to say, this is how you need to interject, this is how you need to interrupt, so that you can advocate for your teammates so that she doesn't constantly have to advocate for herself. And so I think with this concept of admitting mistakes, it's about always being willing to self-reflect when we've made a mistake, but also teaching our athletes that it's everybody's role to be willing to speak up as a champion for inclusion when you witness exclusionary behaviors, unintentional bias, or blatant discrimination. And we all have to practice how we can course correct in those moments when conversation has gone off course. So being willing to say things like, I think I heard you say this, but can you clarify what you mean, right? To help people work through when they've kind of maybe misstepped in a conversation. And so I know there were a couple of points there. I don't know. I know Savannah maybe had a story that she thought she could tell around learning from mistakes on this topic. So Savannah, do you want to share some of your thoughts?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say necessarily it's a story, just more so like experiences that I've had here and there after, especially like the election this year. I think the biggest thing is being open-minded and like being receptive to, I don't want to say criticism, but I mean, basically being receptive to criticism. Like Michelle said, knowing when you've overstepped and being okay with people like correcting you, like, hey, you know, this isn't totally ethical. Maybe there's a different approach we can take to like your thought process, and like sit down and have that dialogue with them, because you can't really blame ignorance because they don't know. So no one's going to learn unless you take the time to sit down and have those hard and, you know, uncomfortable conversations with people. But kind of going off of that, this year, I think I've had more people after and pretty much during this whole election time come up to me and ask me about the Black Lives Matter movement, equality, all that kind of stuff than I ever have in my entire life from this community. And so I think it just kind of goes to show like the shift that we're making right now, and hopefully we can keep moving forward with that. But yeah, just knowing when when it's time to have those conversations, when you're in the wrong, when to be receptive, just things like that. So, yep.
Thanks for sharing that, Steph. All right, just a couple of more key points here, and then we'll really try to get back to the dialogue. So 2 more key things to think about as we are trying to have effective dialogue on diversity and inclusion. 1, we really need to make sure that we are demonstrating curiosity. So one thing that I think, especially as coaches, a lot of us are good at doing is asking leading questions where we probably already kind of know the answer. We know the answer we expect. We know the answer we're looking for. But we just kind of are like framing our statement in the form of a question. And when it comes to conversations on inclusion, it's really, really important that we try to avoid that we genuinely get better at asking open-ended questions where you're not necessarily trying to lead anywhere. You're just trying to learn and better understand the experiences somebody else has had in life so that you can think differently about their experience. And then really that kind of leads into the last point is I think the underpinning of all of the conversations that we want to have here is that we have to lead with empathy. We all have to remember that when we come into these conversations, that we are all fighting our own battles every day, and that looks different and unique for each and every one of us. And we have to use this dialogue to experience life from another person's point of view. And for us as coaches, we have to do everything we can to demonstrate being a role model and how we show empathy towards others. As coaches, by relating and connecting with our athletes, it's really the key way that we can inspire and empower their lives as we really make sure that they learn these lessons that we want them to carry forward outside of the gym. All right, so that was the boring part. And I think we did okay on time. But really now I think the most important thing that we can do is hear more from Riley and Savannah so that we can really learn about their experiences and understand why this is so important to them and therefore why it needs to be important to us as coaches. And so as we pivot into the next session on dialogue, what we really want everybody to hear is how big of a difference having some of this dialogue on inclusion and opening the door for really getting everybody's best self into the gym, how big of a difference it can make for your team. And we want to, have the coaches here hear directly from the girls. What does it look like when you have an inclusive space? And what does it look like when you don't? And so I will turn it to the girls. Maybe let's start with Riley. Riley, can you tell us about a time when you felt like you really had no ally and it negatively impacted you as a player and negatively impacted your team?
Yeah. So I'm going to circle back around to this same story about the girl who kept using the N-word. I mean, like I said, we were young and nobody had really been in a situation like this before. So no one knew how to handle it. I could tell that my teammates were kind of like, oh, I know this isn't right, but nobody knew how to go about it. And so, I mean, I had no one. I was confronting her by myself. And it impacted me a lot. Like I didn't want to be around her, which means I didn't want to be around the team. We were in a house together for a week at a tournament and it was miserable for me. I didn't want to work together with her on the court. I didn't trust her. So, I mean, that really had a negative impact on me as a player. And I mean, obviously impacted my team as well. I didn't want to be there. I didn't trust my teammates. And it was also really hurtful that nobody else was standing up with me. I knew that they knew it wasn't right, but it just hurt that I didn't hear anybody speak up and say, stop.
Yeah. And so Riley, I'm curious because it is so challenging, right? And not to excuse it, but I'm curious for other athletes, are there tips that you have for how to interject in a really productive way to advocate for others?
Yeah. It is tough. It's a really hard conversation to have, and I don't even feel comfortable having it all the time still. But I guess my tip would be, first of all, like in this situation, she was blatantly in the wrong. Like that's just not a word that you use, especially when somebody asks you to stop repeatedly. So if I were like an outsider looking in, like I would tell her, hey, like it's not okay that you use this word. You don't have to like attack her, just be like, you're making people uncomfortable. Like it's not a word that you should be using. And then that's it. And then also I would probably like reach out to the player who's really being affected and like, are you okay? Is there anything that I can do for you? How should we move forward from this? And just like make them feel supported and know that they're not by themselves.
I love that. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
So I want to jump to Savannah then for maybe that same question. Savannah, have you had an experience where you didn't really feel supported, and can you talk about how that impacted you and the team?
Yeah, so on my high school team, I mentioned earlier that I grew up in a conservative, predominantly white town. So basically, it was kind of the same situation as Riley said, but it was almost every single girl on my team, almost, that was saying things like that. On top of this was, I think it was the midst of when the whole Colin Kaepernick kneeling thing was happening. And so I was a big advocate for him, and so I was really thinking about like kneeling for the next game that we had. And I had mentioned it to one of the girls that I thought I was pretty close with, and it circled around to the whole team. The whole team found out, like no one was talking to me. And then I had parents that were talking to my mom, like, oh, like let's see what happens if she kneels, like basically threatening me kind of. And then it kind of happened with the girls too, or things like that were happening. And so that kind of messed me up on the court a little bit. I mean, having no one having your back when you think that you have like your whole team that you're close with kind of sucks. But yeah, I think that would be a perfect example of when I've had something like that happen to me. As for moving forward from that, I think it just comes with personal growth and like diversity for sure. Like getting out of Muhammad and being on my team at Kent, like I have so many better people surrounding me that are emotionally there and like understand where I'm coming from despite their own opinions on race and stuff like that, because they don't have to experience things like this every day. But they're willing to understand. And I think it really is just personal growth and being like ethical about things. So yeah.
So Savannah, as you think back about that situation that you described with your high school team, like if you were put in that same exact situation today, is there anything you would approach differently? Any different conversations you would have? Like what have you even learned from that maybe?
I think, and I was also on, and I said this earlier, the team that Riley was on, with the girl that was saying that. And I had, growing up, a really, really hard time speaking up about things. And just recently, like this past year, I finally found my voice and was able to like advocate for myself and other people. So there are a lot of things that I would have done differently. Definitely would have sat down with the coaches, probably even the parents and the players, and been like, okay, this should be a safe space. Let's get everything out there. I want to like help you guys see things from my point of view, and like just things like that. There was a lot of different approaches that I probably would have taken had I been there or where I am now then. But
Thanks for sharing that. And so this next question, I know both of you have already hit on this a little bit. So just know, like, feel free to hear this question and then take it your own direction. Okay. But Riley, first with you. So in contrast to the short story you just shared, do you have another example of a time when you did have an ally and how it empowered you and how it improved your team?
Yeah. So actually pretty recently, kind of when the whole George Floyd thing happened this summer, a lot of the athletes on the Illinois campus decided to organize our own march. And so that was awesome. And so pretty much my entire team came out, which was amazing. And I was so excited about the march. But then when I was actually there, like seeing them next to me, like posters in hand, like it was amazing. I felt so supported. And I was like, wow, like I love these people. And I know that they really care about me. And I know they support me. I got so many messages that night saying, like, we're here for you. We support you. Like, we stand with you. And that's seriously like all that I can ask for. And I mean, and it proves like it improves my relationship with my teammates so much. Like I trust them definitely off the court, but it even changes how I play with them off on the court because I love these people unconditionally and like I trust them and I want to play well for them and I want to win for them. So they really do go hand in hand.
For sharing that. So I love how they physically showed up for you, and I love hearing how they even messaged you separately. Having gone through that, do you guys feel like you now have a safer space to have dialogue on this topic too? Do you talk about it in a formal team setting, informal, both and? Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So like kind of over the quarantine this summer, like we had a lot of team Zooms about this topic. It was something that weighed really heavy on my heart. And I know that my coaches knew that. So they were constantly like reaching out, saying, what can we do for you? How do you want to approach this? And so we did end up having quite a few team discussions about it. We did it in many forms. We did it like as an entire team. I did it individually with people. I did it in smaller groups, just to like kind of take different forms because some people are more comfortable in certain settings. But I mean, pretty much I opened the floor like all the time. I was like, reach out to me whenever you want, please. Like, I'm always happy to talk about it. And so just like giving people different options to talk about it. And so my coaches were also really good about it. Like they started the conversation, which was a huge thing because I'm not sure if people would have been as comfortable with it if the coaches hadn't been like, okay, this is something that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, that's so important. Thanks for sharing that. So Savannah, similar question for you. Do you have an example of a time where you did have an ally and you felt like that really made a difference for you and for your team?
Yeah, so I have two. One of them is with my team and then past team members. So the first one, I had organized or helped organize a march in my hometown. And I mean, you showed up and then I had a couple of girls from my team that was on my 17th year of club show up too. And so having people physically show up for me was really important. And then recently, this past semester at Kent State, we had issues with, we have this huge like boulder rock type of thing in the middle of campus. And basically it's free for anyone to go and like self-express. So they'll like spray paint, whatever you want on it. It's really cool. And it's been there for a long time. But this past semester, it's been used poorly. Like people would go to it and spray paint like white supremacist type of things, like White Lives Matter, all that kind of stuff. And it was kind of scary, but we organized our whole, like the student body basically showed up and we marched from the middle of campus to the Rock. And I think it was a couple girls on my team and then almost the whole football team showed up too. And we just marched together down there with the rest of the students and some of the staff too. So that was another time where I felt like I had multiple allies, which was really cool, especially having the girls on my team there. It meant a lot.
Thanks for sharing that, Savannah. So Riley, I don't know if you can see the IM window, but maybe as you read that question, it might be good to comment on, because I think really we're kind of getting towards the end of time now. What I really wanted to make sure we had a chance to do is to just kind of open the floor to you each and say, so Riley, if you could go first, like what are the final thoughts you want to leave the group with? What's something important you want to make sure everybody remembers from this conversation and takes forward with them as they think about how they interact with their teams?
Yeah. So I think that my final thought would be like kind of what I mentioned earlier, just being comfortable with getting uncomfortable. You don't make any progress when you're in your comfort zone and just talking about things that are easy for you, because this isn't an easy topic for anyone, but that's how we make progress. It's just like how it is. So it is uncomfortable, but it's a conversation that has to be had. Nobody is excluded from this. And so I just think that we need to recognize that it's uncomfortable, but it really is for the greater good.
Thanks for sharing that. Savannah, what are some of your final thoughts that you want to leave the group with?
As far as I'm mute for a second. Yeah, kind of just going along with Riley said, it really is about being comfortable with being uncomfortable. Like you're not going to get anywhere until you have those hard conversations with people, and especially with people you care about the most too. Like they're going to be more willing and open to hear your personal experiences and stuff like that, hopefully. So definitely take advantage of that, and talk to as many people as you can about it. Talk about it with your teammates, talk about it with your your family members, your friends, all of that. Like, get as many people on board with the movement, and just with being more ethical as you can. And yeah.
Sharing that. So I guess maybe just one more question to both of you, and thank you so much for those final thoughts. But I think one of the questions from the coaches, which I think would be really good to comment on, is when there is a strong foundation of trust, it might be much more welcomed, right, for a coach to come in and talk about this with you. Do you guys have any tips for how coaches can engage in this conversation with their athletes when maybe that trust is still being built early in the season? Any recommendations or suggestions for how to get started there?
You can start. You can start.
To be completely honest, so I'm a sophomore now, and so I've been with my coach for about a year before all of this stuff started coming up. And so we honestly didn't have the best relationship. Like, we got along fine, but we just like weren't super close. I didn't feel like I could especially trust him or anything. But it was like when he reached out to me and said, "What can I do for you?" that I started to be like, "Oh, okay, like now I'm starting to trust you." So, I mean, we've been together for a year, so we like knew each other, but it wasn't until this that I was like, okay, I trust him and I feel comfortable talking to him. So, I mean, yes, it's good to have some sort of relationship, but to be honest, the fact that he reached out just meant so much to me. And now I feel comfortable calling him all the time, talk about different things. And it was just like, from that moment on, our relationship got so much better. So I wouldn't hesitate to talk to someone just because you're not sure if you have that relationship.
Kind of going off of that, I think it's really important to make a point to check in on your athletes as a coach. Like Riley said, it really makes all the difference if it seems like you care, or like someone cares about what you're going through that might not really be experiencing what you're going through. But other than that, I would say maybe like setting up the meeting times when you're about to have those conversations, and just leaving the floor open to start with the people that need to talk about what they need to talk about is really big too, because it kind of builds that foundation of trust. So, and then just being a good listener, and yeah.
All right. Well, Riley and Savannah, thank you so much for sharing your stories. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of just close out my section, and then I'll turn it over to Steve to really close out the full session. And then we can also save time for some more additional Q&A at the end. But as we think about wrapping up this specific conversation today, I had 3 thoughts I wanted to leave the group with. So first of all, the first thing I have for everybody here is a challenge. So for each of us that called in today, there are probably at least 20 other coaches that we know that didn't hear this, but that realistically probably need to. And so my challenge to you is look through your Insta, look through your Facebook, or even if you're old school, just look through the contact list on your phone and think about who are 5 people that you could share this webinar with when we're done, to help encourage them to think differently about why this topic matters and why this is something we all need to be prepared to do as coaches. My second thought is that our role as coaches is to make sure that every single one of our players feels valued. And when we do this as coaches, our players naturally want to give more of themselves to their team. And when our athletes give their very best, the individual athlete and the team as a whole benefit from deeper engagement, which leads to better outcomes on and off the court. And so my closing thought is just keep in mind that we can all do hard things. Our athletes can handle this. We can handle this. Be okay with being a little bit uncomfortable. Discomfort is the starting point of growth. And I'm sure that as coaches, we have all told our athletes that exact same thing, but this is a moment where we need to tell ourselves that too. But one thing that I think is important is that as hard as these conversations are, we also need to start trying to remove a little bit of the emotion from it. We need to stop whispering about it. We need to stop labeling it as sensitive. And we need to start getting comfortable asking questions and listening. The sooner that we start treating inclusion like any other goal that we have for our team, the sooner we can begin making progress. And so just remember, this is just like any other goal. Inclusion is the goal, and we have to bring intent and focus to how we develop a plan to reach that goal as a team. And like it or not, we are some key role models in the lives of our athletes, and we can teach them how to do hard things. So let's not shy away from this opportunity. So thank you guys for attending today and listening. And so thank yous from my perspective. Thank you to Steve and Lauren at JVA for making this happen. And thank you so much for Riley and Savannah for being here today and to share these personal stories. We are so grateful you could be here. So thank you. So Steve, do you want to take it?
Absolutely. So just before we open it up to questions, again, I want to thank Michelle, Riley, and Savannah. I mean, obviously, I'll even change my verbiage from Michelle's last statement, and as we understand, these are not fun conversations, but they have to be had. And kind of like Savannah talked about before, up until this point, I hadn't really had a voice with it as well. So it's really, over the last 6 to 7, 8 months has really, as I've had to progress through for myself is when my voice started coming out. And this obviously platform helps that too. So appreciate you guys taking the time to go through and obviously, again, help us all because we're learning off each other and kind of playing off each other with this. So, as Michelle mentioned, sometime next week, probably around Tuesday or Wednesday, we'll release the educational piece that will go to this to obviously help. We know a lot of clubs and coaches are starting that process of tryouts or finishing tryouts and going into team placement. So this is really a great time to start to facilitate those conversations at the very beginning stage, because then it helps prolong your season and it helps give you something to connect with your teams. As we know, these topics aren't changing, they aren't going away, so we might as well just embrace them and work through them together that way. So that educational piece will start to come out next week. And then our next live discussion again will be December 15th. We haven't set that time yet, on unpacking social language. So it's a little bit of a follow-up of this, but then starting to get into some of that information of what you're looking for when you have those conversations. So had to get the sales plug in there, of course, we know it is. And so now we'll open it up to questions that you guys have. I know there's some going in the chat that I've missed. So Lauren, can you help out with that? And just want to, kind of circle back. So if there's other questions or comments, feel free to throw those out and we'll answer as many as we can.
Yeah, so our first question is for you, Steve. Did you ever have these conversations with your athletes when you were coaching? And is it difficult coming from a male to females? And do you have to change your approach?
Wow, that's actually a good one. Wasn't expecting that. I've actually been very fortunate in my coaching days and career, essentially, that before this year, we hadn't had major prominent issues on the forefront. It was always subtle, small, secondary type things that were kind of handled on an individual, smaller scale. So to have something or to have conversations that were relative to, racial equality, sex equality, any of those things, I can't say that honestly I had up until now. But again, throughout that time, there were always still small instances that we were taking care of. And so thankfully, I've always been considered myself a player's coach in a sense of, and kind of that's, I think, one of the things that Michelle and I are very similar in is we spend a lot of time trying to figure out who each player is as a person, because one, that tells us how far we can push them as a player, but two, we can also see and know emotionally based on how they look, how they feel, how they talk, where they are. And that's kind of how we bridge who they are and how we approach them. And so honestly, I think throughout that time for myself is what has helped me realize how to handle and bridge certain conversations. So I've gotten a little bit of leeway and latitude with it. But again, is it fun and is it easy? Absolutely not. But I think being able to bridge the gap in a sense, and they know where you're coming from, they know that you trust them and you feel for who they are. I think gives you a little bit more power to say, hey, today, this isn't looking good. How can we fix this? Or how can we help you open up this circle? It's not fun, but we definitely have to do it. So, one of the biggest things I would really say to anybody coaching right now is figure out who your players are, because that will take you so much farther on any conversation you have. It doesn't matter if it's family, if it's race, whatever it is, figure out who they are as people. But I can honestly say I've been lucky to not have the major issues throughout my career.
Thanks, Steve. The second question is for Michelle, and that question is, did you find it difficult at first being a white woman teaching this topic?
So the direct answer is no, not with my teams. I will admit where I get a little bit more uncomfortable is when I'm trying to help other coaches. That's where then I feel a little bit, what's the right word, self-conscious on what is my role here? Who thinks that my opinion matters, right? But I can share though, when I've been having the dialogue with my team, I've been very, very comfortable. Some of that is just because of the groundwork that we do to build trust as a team. Some of it is because I've been so lucky to have such wonderful athletes that make me comfortable, right? But in terms of team dialogue, I've always been pretty comfortable. Just really learning how to be more of an advocate outside of just my one team is where some of the discomfort has maybe come in. But luckily, I have Steve and Lauren pushing my limits here. Good.
Learning off each other, right?
Yes.
Lauren, any other questions that we have come through, or?
I think we answered them. Last chance to submit any questions. We have a couple minutes left.
Good. And while we do that, again, just want to thank everybody for being on this call. And if there's questions or things that pop up that you are having with your staffs or things like that, that obviously come after this call, feel free to reach out to any of us. I mean, I think we're all available to help in any kind of a way, because again, I think us putting our minds together and trying to figure out the right ways to start this as well as facilitate them, I think kind of help everybody go through this correct way. So, I mean, it doesn't matter who, what, when, where, how. I think we can help any way we can. So I want to thank everybody again for joining. Again, Michelle, Riley, and Savannah, thank you for you guys putting yourselves out there and, doing this journey with us. And Lauren, are we doing the follow-up email with this, with the recording, or how does that work?
So you will all get an email today or tomorrow with a follow-up from today's session. And you'll also get in that email what I just put in the chat, and that is a SurveyMonkey link to a feedback form. I think we really want to emphasize that this process is totally mutual and in flux and always changing to get better. So please take a moment to fill it out. And if you don't do it now, you can get the link again today or tomorrow in the feedback form.
So thank you all again. I appreciate it. We'll stay on for a couple of minutes just to make sure there's no other questions that come up that someone might want to ask individually. But again, that's the end of our session, and we'll appreciate you guys working through this with us, and look forward to more talks. Next education session or material next week. Next live is the 15th of December, and let the fun continue.